About 200 yards from the White House, there's a nondescript government building. Inside is a tiny agency that happens to be one of the most powerful in the world.
It's been called the most important agency that no one has ever heard of.
It's called OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. It also goes by another name, the Sanctions Office. And that was John Smith, one of its previous directors. This office influences how trillions of dollars move around the world. Right now, the list of the U.S.'s economic sanctions runs over 2,000 pages.
There are dozens of sanctions programs. Russia, Ukraine, regions like Iran or Syria or North Korea, Cuba, so many others. So all of that is handled by these approximately 300 people.
300 people.
The cost to fund the entire agency that is OFAC is probably less than even a single tank or aircraft would be by many, many factors.
It feels like every day the White House announces, and the media broadcasts, news of fresh economic sanctions.
The United States is reinstating some sanctions on Venezuela.
More sanctions against Russia.
Today imposing financial sanctions on 4 Israeli nationals for their destabilization.
You'd think that the federal government is pouring money into the office that oversees them, but it's not. And that has consequences for national and even global security, and the U.S. government's ability to actually enforce sanctions. From Bloomberg's Washington Bureau, this is the Big Take DC podcast. I'm your host, Saleha Mohsin. During the Trump administration, when John Smith was running OFAC, I was desperate to talk to him. But he knew better than to talk to me. I was a reporter covering the U.S. Treasury Department really closely. And I was obsessed with everything his office was doing and finding out the sanctions that they were working on before anyone else. Because knowing that can tell you a lot about how the White House is thinking about foreign policy.
Sanctions have been called the alternative between words and war, between military boots on the ground on the one hand or just mere diplomacy on the other.
Let me take a second to explain just how sanctions work. We live in a world that runs on dollars, literally. So when the U.S. wants to put pressure on a foreign business, a government, or even a person, it uses the dollar as leverage.
So, for example, Russia's war in Ukraine, OFAC's actions and sanctions actions have frozen in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
OFAC is the kind of DC office that tends to pop up on the radar from time to time, but only in significant moments. After 9/11, President George W. Bush launched the global war on terror with sanctions.
Today, we have launched a strike on the financial foundation of the global terror network.
The tanks came later.
Coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance.
Bush promised to follow the money that enabled terrorists to take down the World Trade Center. He wasn't the first to view sanctions as a foreign policy tool. The U.S. dabbled in them in the fallout from the American Revolution, so they're literally in our country's DNA. But OFAC was born later.
It got its start in World War II to help implement and enforce the U.S. response to Nazi Germany.
When I covered the Treasury Department, I worked really closely with my colleague Nick Wadhams. While I was looking at sanctions from the economic angle, he was focused on national security. He's now an editor at Bloomberg.
This is something that's become basically the go-to tool of first resort for the U.S. government as a way to flex its muscle overseas. And OFAC sits at the very center.
In the 20 years since 9/11, the number of entities the U.S. has sanctioned has skyrocketed by almost 1,000%. But the office that manages them, OFAC, it's grown by just 100 or so people. At least that's as far as I can tell from my sources, since Treasury doesn't disclose that publicly. It now has some 300 lawyers and financial investigators to comb through troves of classified and public data, all in the name of serving American foreign policy goals. But that increase is hardly enough to keep up with the increasing reliance on the office.
Seemingly every lawmaker now basically has a sanctions package in their back pocket that they want to unveil against whoever it might be.
Economic sanctions have become so important to the U.S. government that in 2022, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, President Joe Biden talked about them at the very beginning of his State of the Union address.
We're cutting off Russia's largest banks in the international financial system, preventing Russia's central bank from defending the Russian ruble, making Putin's $630 billion war fund worthless. We're choking Russia's access.
I remember that moment. I've covered sanctions for years, and it's the first time I've heard a president talk about them in such a high-profile speech.
U.S. sanctions are powerful because the U.S. economy is so powerful. The U.S. financial system is the avenue through which basically every banking transaction gets done. So if you then say, okay, you, a foreign entity or a foreign person, we're not going to give you access to the U.S. financial system, that person is essentially banished financially. They can't get a credit card. They can't get a bank account. They can't pay their employees. They can't buy goods. So suddenly they are essentially ostracized from the entire global financial system.
Consider the action America took against Iran to rein in its nuclear ambitions. In 2017 and 18, the Trump administration levied more than 900 sanctions on Iran-related targets. And Iran's economy shrunk around 5% in each of those years. But in order for OFAC's sanctions to have the economic bite that they're known for, someone needs to make sure they're being enforced.
One thing I heard, that OFAC really needs more money for enforcement, like figuring out who's violating the sanctions and bringing a case that would then help punish that entity for not following the sanctions.
OFAC works with other parts of the government to enforce sanctions. For example, in 2014, OFAC was part of a case against France's largest bank, accusing it of violating sanctions on Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. The bank pleaded guilty and paid almost $9 billion to settle the matter. But John Smith told me that this tiny office can't manage all of this on its own.
It's implementing dozens upon dozens of sanctions programs, including some of the most important to our U.S. national security and foreign policy, and it simply doesn't have the resources that it needs.
Up next, what's stopping the federal government from giving this small but mighty office more to work with? John Smith used to run OFAC, the U.S. government's sanctions office.
It is startling just how little money it takes to run OFAC as it is today.
And he told me that OFAC doesn't just run on an incredibly tight budget, but it actually turns a profit for the U.S.
OFAC punches above its weight. Any dime that's given to OFAC will be magnified far beyond. It's a moneymaker. OFAC has an enforcement function where OFAC issues dozens of enforcement actions. Those enforcement actions can come often in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars a year that goes to the general treasury.
Remember that French bank I mentioned? The one that had to pay billions of dollars for violating OFAC's sanctions? Almost half of that money went to a federal fund, an account controlled by Congress. OFAC did not get that money.
That is different than many enforcement agencies where Congress has passed laws that basically wants to encourage those enforcement agencies to do more enforcement actions. And so Congress has passed laws that allow certain enforcement agencies to keep the funds.
Basically, Congress hasn't given OFAC the resources to fully enforce all of its sanctions programs. So instead, it puts some of that onus on the private sector.
It doesn't actually enforce the sanctions a lot itself. It relies on banks.
My colleague Nick told me that OFAC has tossed the hot potato of enforcement over to businesses. One way it does this is by leaving banks and other companies guessing.
So they will issue a very ambiguous rule saying certain types of financial transactions with a Russian company or a type of Russian company will be banned. And then when you look at that rule, you're a lawyer looking for exact language about that rule. It's extremely ambiguous and you have no idea what's going on. And so the response, if you're a lawyer for Citibank, you just say, okay, we're not going to get anywhere near the Russian economy.
If there's one thing I've learned as a reporter at Bloomberg, it's that investors and the business sector don't like uncertainty, especially from the U.S. government. But it seems like OFAC is accidentally creating some of that.
I had all sorts of conversations with people who would say, we would go to OFAC for advice saying, hey, you guys issued this rule. clarify this rule for us. Tell us what this actually means. And the response would take like 6 months to a year. They would blame that on underfunding because OFAC only had like 2 lawyers working on a certain file, or they didn't have nearly enough compliance people, or half the compliance people were out on vacation or on leave, or they were sick or whatever. They could not get an answer.
John Smith believes there are real consequences to comically slow policy responses and strapped budgets.
Every bit of time lost, every bit of use of old technology means that we're that much further behind those that seek to evade sanctions so they can raise money for terrorist attacks against U.S. targets, against WMD-related activities where bad actors are raising money for nuclear proliferation, against counter-narcotics efforts where our sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers may be harmed.
All this brings up a really important question. Do sanctions even work?
Nothing works 100%, but sanctions have been demonstrated to work, but they take time. So, for example, there was a tough economic sanctions program in World War II, but it wasn't sanctions alone that won that war. It was the U.S. military might and our strategic sense, and sanctions played a role.
We could do an entire episode on whether sanctions work or not. It's really complicated and hard to measure. Take the example of Russia. In the 2 years since its invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. has placed more than 3,500 sanctions on Russian individuals, businesses, and even aircraft. Now, Russia's economy is on track to shrink by 8% in the next 2 years. But Russian manufacturing has actually grown to support the war effort, so the country's GDP is still growing. Smith did point to examples of sanctions working.
Sanctions played a role in the apartheid crisis. We weren't sending troops to South Africa, but we included a global coalition that said to South Africa, we will no longer deal with you if you continue your apartheid regime and that jurisdiction. And they finally changed. With respect to Iran, Iran said it would never negotiate over its nuclear program until it did, and until it came to the negotiating table and we reached an agreement.
So if sanctions really can pack a punch, and OFAC is the main body responsible for them, why has its budget remained so low for so long? Smith told me that it comes down to Congress, which determines public spending.
You hear so much from members of Congress wanting more sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, Russia, China, across the board. Sometimes sanctions bills may be among the only bipartisan things that are passed through Congress. But while Congress may want more sanctions, Congress may not actually want to fund what they want.
In Congress, the Appropriations Committee decides what gets funding, but different committees determine how it's spent. In the case of sanctions, it's the Foreign Relations and Banking Committees.
Sometimes I feel like there may be a disconnect between those panels that are pushing for additional sanctions, mandated sanctions, and those on the panels on the appropriations committees that are actually deciding what funds to provide.
But John Smith is still holding out hope that someday someone in government might start paying attention to this underdog of an office.
I'm waiting for the administration or the Congress that says, well, wait, this agency is making money for the U.S. government. Let's see what more they can do if we give them more than a drop of the bucket in increase.
To his mind, there's a lot at stake beyond the walls of that nondescript office building right by the White House.
I think it's the question, should we be doing more against human rights abuses and corruption around the world? Should we be doing more to focus on terrorist activities and support for terrorism around the world? The money sent to OFAC really has an outsized impact.
Thanks for listening to the Big Take DC podcast from Bloomberg News. I'm Saleha Mohsin. This episode was produced by Julia Press, Naomi Shavin, and Stacey Wong. It was fact-checked by Tiffany Choi. Alex Sugiera and Blake Maples are our mix engineers. Our story editors are Wendy Benjaminson and Michael Shepard. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is our head of podcasts. If you liked what you heard, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show. It'll help other listeners find us. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back next week.